If you were to pick one mechanic in RTS that's certain to cause a few frayed nerves, then my money would be on stealth. There's something especially frustrating about an attack that you can't see coming, is immune to interception and normally requires special preparation to respond to. Hi, I'm Calvin, and today we're going to discuss the invisible, talk about why stealth is such a desired but difficult mechanic to get right, and look at how a few games have chosen to handle these unobservable units.
For king and country.
Stealthy units aren't often a lot of fun to play against. Sure, they might not rattle an experienced veteran, but to the new or casual player they can feel like they've had the wall pulled over their eyes and the rug pulled from under their feet. This feeling is dependent on the actual mechanics of the game in question, but in the worst cases you can be left sitting there while your buildings and units are dismantled in front of your very eyes, starting with the only one that could produce something to unmask your attackers. The most frustrating part can be the disconnect between what you know and can see and what your troops can actually respond to. You know the stealthy units are there, you can see their projectiles appear from thin air, but your machine gunners, mortar teams and hover tanks are unable to put two and two together and start hosing the general area. Even in games with slightly more manageable stealth mechanics, it can be almost as frustrating to watch a wave of enemies appear, do massive damage and then melt into the background whenever you try to respond. But if the mechanic can be so frustrating to play against, then why does it exist? Well, I think the answer is simple. It's cool. It might not be cool for you, but your opponent is having the time of their lives as they cripple your forces and escape unscathed. They feel like a master ninja assassin and a tactical genius all rolled into one, and I think it's universally accepted that ninjas are cool, whether they be real ninjas, fantasy ninjas or robo-space ninjas. From a game mechanic point of view, they also exist for the sake of variety. There are only so many ways you can tweak the armour, movement characteristics and weapons of a soldier or vehicle to serve a different purpose, and if you add some sort of stealth mechanic into the mix, then you can instantly change the dynamic and use case of that particular unit. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. Stealthy units are normally fragile but powerful, and if done well can give a bit of room for a particularly skilled player to exercise some fine control and get a lot of value for their production cost. Problems often arise when they are implemented poorly and feel like nothing more than a gamble. These units and the defences against them are often rather high-tech and expensive to research and produce. Did your opponent build the anti-stealth unit or building? If they did, your stealth units are worthless. If they didn't, congratulations, you've won the game. In some games they really feel like a desperate roll of the dice rather than something that integrates into a larger strategy. You might disagree, and I'll admit that it's highly dependent on not just the actual game in question, but also the level of play involved. Things tend to work differently at the top of the ladder or in a professional tournament than they do in a standard matchmaking game or casual skirmish between friends. The Command & Conquer series incorporates plenty of stealthy units but takes a pretty balanced approach when it comes to implementation. There are actually two types of subterfuge in these games, disguises and invisibility. Some units choose to hide in plain sight by looking like something else. The spy in the Red Alert games appears as a regular infantry unit to the opposition, and if there's a lot going on, it's quite easy to miss one as they blend into the other background noise. However, the counter to them is cheap and easy to deploy. Attack dogs can sniff them out and dispatch them with a single leap. The spy is also balanced by its lack of combat potential or direct destructive effects. It's still pretty potent, and depending on what facility you infiltrate, you can steal some of their resources, reveal their building queue, reset their fog of war and other such mischief. What I like most about this unit is how it serves part of a larger game plan. You can't simply build a bunch of them and use them to win the game, but you can use them to indirectly increase the potential of your other forces. Sneaking into a power station in Red Alert 2 and temporarily shutting it down while you strike at their base can disable some of their defences and obscure their minimap, giving your ground assault a far better chance of success. There are also plenty of invisible units in Command & Conquer, most iconically the stealth tank, first found in the original and then present throughout the whole series. But here stealth only offers partial protection. Units equipped with it are invisible when they're stationary or moving, but as soon as they make an attack they lose that protection for a short time and are vulnerable to counterattack. There are also lots of detection options available, including some of the first tier base defences and scouting units. This results in a situation where the stealth tank, and other stealthy units, are a secondary raiding force rather than a primary strike formation. They are great at hitting out exposed units, forcing your opponent to defend their harvesting operations and punishing them for becoming overstretched. But just like with the spy, this makes them part of your overall game plan rather than the backbone of it. You're not going to overwhelm an equal opponent with masses of stealth tanks, but you can grind them down with a war of attrition until your regular forces can get the job done. I'm personally quite fond of this style of implementation. Stealthy assets in these games have a specific niche that they're particularly good at, but they aren't an overwhelming force that can't be handled if you choose the wrong tech path. They are powerful if used correctly, but aren't anything close to an I win button and don't feel too oppressive. Another game with an even more reserved application of stealth is Company of Heroes, which to the best of my knowledge is only a single unit in this class, the Sniper. This unit is invisible to the enemy only if 3 conditions have been met. Nothing is too close, it remains in cover, and it hasn't fired recently. The long range, high accuracy and ability to one-shot kill make it great for taking out entrenched weapon teams or exposed units, but it's easily run down by flanking infantry or light vehicles if left unsupported. It's not possible to build a whole mess of them and storm the enemy base, but a single sniper properly integrated into the rest of your army is a force to be reckoned with, and if used properly and well micromanaged can be an absolute menace for your opponent to deal with. Now, as I've been playing a lot of Beyond All Reason lately, I think it's worth mentioning how it handles these sorts of capabilities, as it's got a level of depth that surpasses many other games in this regard. There are actually 2 categories of subtlety, stealth and cloaking. Some units have one, some units have the other, and a few have both. Stealth is an always-on mechanic, and it has the effect of making that particular unit invisible to the enemy radar. This is particularly impactful in BAR. Aside from situational awareness, most units can shoot further than they can see, so quite a lot of fire is exchanged just by radar alone. A lot of units have this ability and it does give them a little bit of an edge, although there are dedicated radar jamming units and structures, so individual stealth is more impactful in the early game or when operating in less busy areas of the map. Alongside stealth is cloaking, which makes the unit invisible. You can still be detected by radar when cloaked, but long-range radar-guided fire is somewhat inaccurate, and the ability to cloak can seriously degrade your opponent's ability to engage that unit and allows easier repositioning. Cloaking also has a small reveal radius where anything that gets too close will immediately force the unit to show itself, and it also uses a lot of energy to maintain, especially while moving. If your energy generation can't keep up with your expenditure, then anything that was invisible will suddenly appear, often with catastrophic consequences. Beyond All Reason balances these units by making them expensive and either very weak or very slow, and there are some high-tech long-range detection options available, as well as the basic but effective method of using some artillery to attack the ground where you expect the invisible units are hiding. A handful of units are both stealthy and have the cloaking ability, so they are invisible to radar and the naked eye, but these are very niche and have very specific purposes. The correct usage of them can make a big difference in a game, but only if paired with other methods of attack and the enemy has been somewhat overconfident or had their focus drawn elsewhere. The game does feature a stealth tank, but this is expensive, flimsy and unlikely to be effective as anything other than a spotter. I have seen a bunch of them sneak through to the enemy backline and destroy a whole base, but only once, and I think this was more of a case of an incompetent target rather than a brilliant and repeatable tactical move. I think the most iconic stealth units from RTS probably come from the StarCraft series. What's interesting about StarCraft is how the mechanics differ between the 3 factions and cover the whole spectrum of possibilities. The Zerg have got the burrowing mechanic, which many units can take advantage of if the correct upgrades are researched. Burrowing makes a unit invisible to enemy units, as well as immobile and unable to do anything apart from unburrow itself. There are a few exceptions to this. Roaches can still move while burrowed, and infestors can do a few things while underground. It varies between the different versions of StarCraft, but generally there are enough restrictions and limitations that it isn't too much of an oppressive mechanic. Don't get me wrong, burrowed banelings used as landmines can be particularly devastating, but if you know your opponent is using them, then all 3 factions have got some mobile airborne detection that can accompany its army and prevent it being caught off guard. The Terrans have got access to the Ghost, and depending on your flavour of StarCraft, have got the Wraith and the Banshee too. These units can become invisible if the correct upgrade is researched, and unlike burrowing, can move and attack while invisible. The limiting factor is energy, and although they can be particularly frustrating to deal with if you're not prepared, the fact that their invisibility only lasts until the energy runs out means that their usage is somewhat restricted, and the Terran player is up against the clock to make the most out of them while the stealth field lasts. This is especially true for Ghosts, whose powerful snipe ability also costs energy, presenting a choice between attack power or sustained protection. I think this is a pretty reasonable implementation of the stealth mechanic. It's still powerful, but it's got enough limitations that the defending player can work with to provide a suitable response. On the far end of the scale, the Protoss have the Dark Templar and the Observer. The latter is a flying drone that gives a lot of vision, is permanently stealth, and acts as a detector to reveal other stealth units. They're normally used to spy on the enemy base or expansions from just outside of detection range, or to accompany your own forces and keep them safe from the enemy's stealth attackers. Despite having permanent and unlimited stealth, the Observer is balanced in the fact that it has no direct combat potential of its own. It provides valuable detection and intel, but it's up to the rest of your forces to do something with that knowledge. The Dark Templar differs from all of the other stealth units that we've discussed in StarCraft in the fact that it has no real restrictions. You build it, it starts in stealth, stays in stealth indefinitely, and can move and attack without ever revealing itself. It does a lot of damage, and if you don't have any way to detect it, then your only option is to sit there while it chews through your valuable buildings, workers, and anything else in close proximity. However, the Dark Templar isn't without problems. They require expensive tech and they're costly to produce, and if you do have a way to detect them, then they aren't really anything much more than an overpriced zealot. This is the problem with how some of the stealthy units in StarCraft work and feel, as their impact in a game varies greatly depending on the skill level of the players involved. In higher end games, they slot neatly into other strategies. Their production structures are scouted and defences are created, so you'll normally find them used to harass distant expansions or other such tertiary work. Sometimes they'll just be produced to force your opponent into committing resources to defending against them, rather than relied on to secure victory. Every missile tower or photon cannon produced is a bunch of minerals that can't be used to prop up an army. In lower level games it's a different story, and in my own experience I would more often than not find them used as a gamble to secure victory rather than part of a larger strategy. This is where they are at their most frustrating to play against, and back in the day when I used to play StarCraft 2, these mechanics could be very off-putting to the newer or more casual players. A Terran player might rush out a few early cloaked banshees. If the opposing player had built a counter, it instantly failed and the game was lost. If they hadn't, then the game was won. Not something a veteran would fall for. They would have scouted the production and tech structures earlier, or figured out the possibility based on what else the Terran player wasn't doing. But someone less experienced would struggle and feel cheated by it. It was the same with a Protoss player attempting to cannon rush a Terran. If that failed, they would go into Dark Templar and just roll the dice one more time hoping for an automatic victory. Was it legitimate? Well, of course it was, it's all part of the game, but that didn't make the conclusion a satisfying one. I think this is where StarCraft's otherwise interesting and varied implementation of stealth falls down, as the usage and effect on the game is dramatically different depending on the level of play. But this isn't really much of a criticism. StarCraft is what it is, and if you attempt to change it, it generally just gets worse. It's also been years since I've played any ladder matches, so I'm hardly in a place to provide any real detailed background on the ins and outs of the effect of these units in games. So, what can we say about stealthy mechanics in RTS? Generally, I find them to be an important addition and one that can add a lot of variety in both individual units and available tactics. I think they are at their very best when they're designed in such a way that they have to be integrated into a larger strategy to be effective, and they're at their very worst when they can win a game all by themselves if the correct hard counter isn't enacted. From a lore perspective, I think they work best when their power is limited, as it prevents you from asking the hard questions. Questions like, if detection technology is cheap enough to cram into the bargain basement missile turret, then why isn't it included by default into the command centres and battle cruisers? Seems like a bit of an oversight to me, and if I was in charge, I think I'd probably put a call into the manufacturer. Hi there, thanks for skulking silently through my stealthy sermon. If you enjoyed this video, then click the like button, and if you've got your own thoughts on stealth, then let me know them in a comment or on the Discord. And if you want more of this sort of thing, then subscribe to my channel, and I hope to see you back soon.